Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 21 Hats podcast. I'm your host, Lauren Feldman. If you've been listening to this podcast, you know that we've been taking periodic dives into the world of employee stock ownership plans. We started down this path because Jay Goltz was thinking about his own succession issues. In a series of podcasts and conversations and seminars over the course of more than a year, Jay progressed through the 3 stages of ESOP discovery. First, he had his eyes opened. Wait a second, if you're an ESOP, you don't pay taxes? Then he got a little euphoric. I think I can make more money owning 70% of the business than I do now owning 100%. And then he confronted what I've been calling the ESOP industrial complex. The big firm lawyers and consultants that sometimes seem inclined to make ESOPs as complicated and expensive as possible. They want to charge me a success fee for finding a buyer, even though they didn't find the buyer? That introduction to Big ESOP occurred at a conference that Jay and Sean Bussey attended in Portland, and that left Jay convinced that ESOPs are probably right for a lot of people, but not for him. And yet, it was also at the conference in Portland that Sean and Jay met Phil Hayes, who takes a decidedly different approach than the industrial complex gang. What immediately stood out about Phil, who calls himself the ESOP guy and who has his own podcast, Journey to an ESOP, is that he doesn't view his mission as selling owners on ESOPs. His goal is to help owners figure out which solution is best for them, whether that's an ESOP or something else. Which is why Sean and I decided to sit down with Phil and have a conversation, brought to you by our sponsor, The Great Game of Business, about his approach. The episode is titled, The Long Journey to Really Understanding ESOPs. Welcome, Sean and Phil. It's great to have you both here. For the past year or so, we've been presenting a variety of perspectives on ESOPs, and we're eager to get yours, Phil. Can you tell us how this became the thing that you specialize in?
I just love the ESOP concept. But I think the greatest reason I got into it is I saw that there's definitely a gap in the industry. And what I mean by that is that there's the need for companies, first off, to be really well educated in the correct things of what is an ESOP, how does it really work. Secondly, I think that there's a problem in the industry where, and it's not like this huge problem, but there's a problem where I think some people don't realize that an ESOP transaction doesn't have to cost millions and millions of dollars. And so looking at that, I had a lot of clients as a CPA firm that were being approached by these types of sell-side advisors. And I decided, you know what? I'm getting questions from my clients from this. I might as well just jump in and start helping them. And I found I loved it, and I love ESOPs. And so I kind of just pivoted my whole career towards doing this full time.
You mentioned that there's a certain lack of understanding about what an ESOP entails. Are there particular issues that you think are most misunderstood?
Yeah, I think there's a host of issues that are misunderstood. I know we kind of hit on the cost side is definitely one of those areas. Some of the things that are just commonly misunderstood is this the structure of an ESOP and how it works with your employees, what the employee's part is in the ESOP, what your part is. I think that's definitely a misunderstanding. There's misunderstandings related to valuations and what a fair market value would work, how that would work for a company. I think overall, a lot of people look at an ESOP as my lowest valuation alternative, and I don't think that that's true. So as you start talking to people, one of the reasons there is a lot of misinformation is because there's different hotbeds, or geographically, there's different places in the country that are, I would say they're ESOP friendly. And then there's other geographic areas that are not. And so what I mean by that is there's a lot of advisors, whether they're CPAs, attorneys, bankers, insurance people, all of them are great at what they do, but they may not understand ESOPs very well. And so sometimes they either give misinformation or they guide somebody away from it. So a lot of the, education that needs to be out there needs to kind of penetrate the advisory areas so that people are more educated, especially in these markets that you're seeing they don't have a lot of, good information for these companies to think about.
That's really interesting, especially thinking about it in geographic terms. That had not occurred to me. What are the most ESOP-friendly parts of the country?
Yeah, I'd say for sure, like Chicago, Illinois is very friendly for ESOPs. Ohio has a strong ESOP chapter that in Columbus and Cincinnati. California is a very strong ESOP state in general. They're very, very geared towards that. Then there's parts in the Northeast, and there's probably others that I'm missing, but I just think in general, those are probably the biggest ones that stick out.
Diving into this issue over the last couple of years, I've gotten the impression that there's something of a choose your own adventure aspect to ESOPs. I don't know if this is a fair statement or not, but it almost seems like no two are alike, that there are a lot of decisions that owners have to make. And that maybe that's part of what contributes to the misunderstanding, because there are different ways to do it. What's your sense of that?
Yeah, I think the first thing I would say is, as an advisor in going into it, one of the premises I start with is, at the very beginning, I'm not saying you should be an ESOP company. And I have a process that basically proves out the ESOP concept. And as we get through it, the first step, the second step, then I think the actual, like you say, the adventure, how we actually structure the ESOP starts to come to light, because there are some things that the shareholder can choose to do. For instance, they could choose bank financing with a seller note or all seller note. They could choose to use warrants in the transaction and SARs, and they could even choose to do what we call a non-leveraged ESOP. So there's different ways to build it, but they're all going to start with the same building blocks. And if you do the process right, in some cases, it's going to lead us to the right place for sure. I've had people refer me business like, hey, help this company with an ESOP. They definitely want to do a partial ESOP. I'm like, well, we don't even know if they want to do a partial ESOP yet, because we haven't really worked through what are their goals and objectives. How are we going to structure this? And there are things that will get flushed out in the planning process in the very first two steps that will contribute to how they actually build that ESOP for them. I'd say the other side of that is that there are some things that are just going to be standard for every ESOP. First off, it's a retirement plan. It's like a 401k plan, but it's a retirement plan, and it's built under the regulated guidance of the ERISA and the Department of Labor and the IRS. So no matter what you do, you're always going to be within the regulations, and your ESOP has to conform to that. So however we pick and choose the way that we structure it, it's not going to deviate from the way the regulations are.
Phil, you said you had a process that you take people through to see if they're appropriate for an ESOP. Could you walk us through that a little bit?
Let me start with the size too, because it can kind of get all over the place when we're thinking about like what size of a company should even think about this and contemplate it. Honestly, I've done ESOP transactions for companies that have somewhere between, say, $800 to $1 million in net income, or if we translate that into EBITDA cash flow. So the revenue isn't as important as the cash flow itself, because the cash flow is going to give us a real strong indication of what we think the transaction value is going to be for the company. And it's going to help us also to build out the models for how do we structure the debt. So that's the first thing. So size in that is going to be, you can go down as I would say as low as that. Something lower than that is going to be problematic, even with the way we structure the cost, just because the cost benefit may not be there for somebody. On an employee size, I will say that if it's an S Corp, we're going to feel really comfortable with anything over 20 employees, because we have to work within the 409P guidelines, which is the disqualified persons test. I have done, and I am doing an ESOP right now for a company that only has 10 people. So that's kind of just the general idea of the sizes.
That example you gave, if you you said they only have 10 people. Can you tell us what their EBITDA figure is?
Yeah, their EBITDA is around $1.5 million.
So that's pretty small.
Yeah, relatively small. And this is why when we think about the cost as well, we can build a transaction for a company that small and still be very, very successful at making it work for everybody, the company, the owners, the other advisors, and putting the whole thing together.
But they've got margin. Like that, the 10-person company, like that's an amazing margin for a 10-person company.
Yeah, obviously that's one of the things you have to look at with the employee roster too, because when we do the allocation of shares to the employees, in that case I'm talking about, there's going to be a very strong benefit to those employees because there's so few employees. So when you're dividing up the allocations for stock, there's going to be, to me, 10 people in that company are going to have a tremendous opportunity to grow, to get the shares and grow that company and have a very strong retirement plan going forward.
So besides the size, what else are you looking for?
So the first thing I would say is, I'll spend several meetings with people, and I don't charge them for this. I just conceptualize. Let's just conceptualize the ESOP. And what I'm trying to get into that is like, what are your goals and objectives? And I'll tell you kind of some experiential things that happen. Like some people are really geared, like you can just tell when I talk to them, they're so geared around, trying to maximize the valuation, that my advice to them is like, if that's all you can, and I don't mean to be demeaning or derogatory, but if that's all you care about, then I think you're better off just pursuing a strategic sale. Because when you try to say, I'll try a strategic sale and I'll kind of look at that in combination with an ESOP, your heart isn't really in the right place for an ESOP. So I'm just kind of really being candid and transparent about that, because they need to see the big picture. Like they love this company they built. They love the employees. They want everybody to have a future, and they also do care about a fair market value. So that's not going to be not important, but it's going to be part of the whole equation. So, a lot of times I'll just try to give them some guidance. My job is not to make every company that calls me an ESOP. I mean, that's, in fact, I don't necessarily talk them out of it, but I'm going through and filtering to help them to save some time to be like, is this really what you want to do? So the process really starts there. If conceptually it works and they get all the things that we're talking about, then the very first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a valuation model. Now, the model itself is going to be mimicking the model or the valuation work that's going to be done in, say, step 5 with a trustee and an independent valuation firm. And there's a lot of like parts and pieces to that model that are important. In my experience at looking at other advisors' work, because this happens from time to time where I'll be hired after somebody else, I don't think that people put enough emphasis on the parts and pieces of that model. They want to go from the model, the valuation model, into the feasibility piece, which I'll talk about next. But the key is that the owner and the key people, they need to understand the connecting points between their financial forecast, their cash flow, their cap rate, the risk rating of the business, their target working capital. They need to understand the mechanics and the correlation of all of these and how they actually translate into an actual real number. Instead of, hey, this is your EBITDA and this is the multiple of EBITDA. It doesn't tell people a lot of information. So that's the first piece. And then going into that, I really stop everything. I don't do anything before we nail that down, because I don't think it's really helpful for people to get thrown into this process and then suddenly they realize they're so deep in it, they really don't even understand what they're doing with it, which is something I've experienced with clients that have hired me after that fact.
Yeah. If you don't mind me pausing for a minute, I think a lot about decision making, how businesses often, they're started by an owner, founder, and that owner founder is really a big part of the decision making organization. How do you evaluate that?
The main thing is, and this is what I love about ESOPs, is we have time to work through that individual. They are the decision maker. And what we have to be thinking about, whether we do an ESOP or we're transitioning to, sometimes I'll do like a management buyout, like your key people just buy you out instead of an ESOP, or we'll do like some hybrid. But either way, whether you're doing an ESOP or not, the key decision maker has to start transitioning their role. And functionally, that needs to start taking place, I think as early as possible. So the ESOP gives us a lot of room to do that. Like, let's lay out the roadmap for how that's going to function. And every company has a different culture, right? And one of the things I always kind of look at is, what is their existing culture right now? Which, if you know this, Sean, and I'm sure you know this, Lauren, a lot of the culture in a business is going to reflect the leadership. So if that decision maker is, maybe more autocratic or, just very bossy, then that culture is going to reflect that. And so one of the things I'm always thinking about is the sustainability of the culture of the future. And if it really is something that let's just say that's the opposite, the owner is just, more of a democratic kind of person who gets everybody involved, is a team-oriented person, obviously we can work a lot with that. But the key is that we got to kind of transition to something. And so the decision maker has to kind of want to do that as well and not be in that place forever.
Why do you have to, Phil? Because I ask because I've heard different versions of this. Obviously, this is a point of great interest for any owner who's contemplating this. Will it still be their company in some sense? Will they still be in charge? Will they still be making decisions? And I've heard some owners who've been through this, who have ESOPs, say, you know what? You control who goes on the board. Ultimately, it's still your company. You can just run it the way you always have.
Sure. No, it's good. It's a good question, Lauren. And it gets to the control aspect of ESOPs and how that really works. I think that they do because it's healthy for the company. Let me just throw out one thing that I think is so important for companies to consider as having maybe one key decision maker before you even do an ESOP or anything else, is thinking about their continuity plan. And so if something were to happen, disablement, or they passed away for some reason suddenly, what's going to happen to that company? What's going to happen to the value of that company? And what's going to happen to their estate in terms of the value, or transitioning the value into their estate? One of my first ESOPs I did was with a good client of mine, and I've known him forever before we even did the ESOP. And he's now, I think we did it 4 years ago, and he's 100% ESOP company. He's 76 and he's still president. He works 12 hours a day, 5 days a week. He loves working. And when we first set it up, he's like, can I still do this? I said, yeah, you can still do this, if that's what you want to do. So he's got a board of 3 people. So it's 100% owned ESOP. There is an independent board member who used to work for the company, but they passed the independent standards from the trustee. Then his son actually is on the board as well. So his son is kind of taking over everything. His son didn't want to buy the company, by the way, in this situation. But I would say if you asked him from a control perspective, it would kind of align with what you're saying, Lauren, and other people have said. The day-to-day decision-making is completely the same as it was when he first started. And the only thing that's kind of gotten, when I think about the changes that have happened, is he's accomplished what he wanted to, which was to transition his ownership. He didn't want to be holding on to that stock, and he's been able to kind of move through that. So I would say that's the majority of the time. You're not going to see a major shift in control, even if you sell, a controlling interest, which is 100% ESOP.
What are, I'm kind of curious from an industry perspective, what are industries you looked at where you go through this process and you're like, this is a really good industry for this type of thing, and this is an industry that it's really tough? Or maybe any and all work, it's more a matter of ideology and structure of the organization.
Yeah, I think that a lot of people that do ESOPs, we all want to talk about industries that really work well. And the reality is there's some industries that are just going to be better for ESOPs. Like I would say architectural and engineering firms. There's, I've got several I've done in my history. I've got more coming into the future. I just closed actually one Friday. So a new ESOP company that we did. And it works well because the individual employees get it pretty fast. The owners get it. There's a very strong teamwork environment in those types of entities. I've seen and I've done several construction companies, and they work pretty well, assuming, all the pieces are there and culture's there, and it works with the decision makers. I would say, though, I've done distributors and manufacturing companies and retail companies. We're doing a retail company right now. So I don't know. For me, if I really look at it, it's not as much to the industry. It is much more, in my opinion, is it culturally a good fit? And I look for things like, what are they working on right now? I've got several clients that are great game of business cultures. So open book management. I've got some that are EOS traction cultures. So those are interesting to me because they're working so much on the business already that ESOPs just make sense because they're not just building business processes, they're getting people involved. So I think it is a lot of ideology and culture. I would say the other financial part of it is the company really does need to have a source of predictable cash flow. If some company has this erratic behavior of cash flow, then it's hard to build a model where we can put a lot of debt on the books and have this tax benefit if they're going to lose money in next year and they're going to come back up. So I'd say that's definitely part of it. I'm going to go towards more the specifics of a good ESOP candidate as opposed to just good industries.
Phil, have you done any ESOPs or seen any ESOPs that just haven't worked for whatever reason?
No, I actually have never done one that hasn't worked. In fact, before I did ESOPs in our firm, we've been doing ESOP work, not the sell side piece, but the consulting piece on tax advisory since 1985. And we've had ESOP companies go through the 08, 09 downturn and they're still fine. So we haven't actually seen any companies go through that. But I think the main thing that I've seen with companies that do go down is, not for our experience, but the people I talk to in the space, is the structuring of an ESOP transaction, I think, is critical in how you go about it. So I talked about like the valuation piece, and we get into the feasibility models. We're going to want to play out some scenarios to protect the company, meanwhile making sure that the owner is getting what they should get from a cash flow standpoint. So structuring debt is really important. Understanding the actual quantifiable tax benefits and building that into the model is going to be important. Stress testing cash flow is going to be important. And then creating backstops. Like, what happens if this happens? So some of this is just good business planning. I mean, when you think about any company that's thinking about their future, any company can fail tomorrow, right? It's a matter of how they're going to adjust towards changes in the marketplace. A lot of times when people look at not selling their business to a strategic buyer, one of the reasons they don't want to sell is because they know their people don't want to work for a company that's only focused on profits. They know that especially nowadays, I think the new culture, the new generations are thinking much bigger than, hey, I just want to make a lot of money. So there's a lot of things that we're getting into that are post ESOP services that I would call ESOP implementation services that help design workforce development, employee engagement surveys. How do you recruit and build people? So when you think about what we're really doing with an ESOP, is we're leveraging one of the greatest assets they have, which is their people. And at the very beginning, when we asked the question, what do you want to do this for? And the owner's like, I really want to do it to help my employees. That's part of the answer, because that they already care about their employees enough to consider their future and the quality of life that they have. So like I said, I could go into a lot of the things like that, but I think those are, to me, very exciting when we do an ESOP company or create an ESOP company, because they get to use all those benefits to creating a very strong business.
I want to address some of the issues about why there's so few businesses that have chosen to do this. I mean, we can all point to lots of examples, but as a percentage, it's a very small percentage of the businesses that exist in this country. And I'm curious why you think that is. A couple of things have come up. I think part of it is we started referring to what we've called the ESOP industrial complex. And I get a sense that some owners are kind of turned off by the bureaucracy that exists. And I think part of it is, as they talk to people who are in the business, two things. One is they get a sense that a lot of it is aimed more at the employees than at the owners. It's like, okay, great, I understand. It's wonderful for the employees. Why is this good for me? And the other thing we've heard is that, it almost seems like they think it's in their interest to make this sound as complicated as possible. Mm-hmm. Does that resonate with you at all?
Yeah, I mean, if I had a very clearly stated mission statement on my podcast, it's to really help in that situation, because I do agree. Unfortunately, I think that there's a lot of ESOP professionals that make this sound way more complicated than it really is. And I can't really know what the motivation is. I mean, we can always speculate, like, if I can make it sound really complicated, then I can charge more money for this, right?
That was Sean's guess, I think, right, Sean?
Call me cynical.
I think culturally, the ESOP industry does suffer from a little bit of that, instead of just saying, hey, let's just be straightforward. This is how it works. It's not for everybody. Because at the end of the day, I just want to sleep at night. I want to make sure I've done the right thing for people that we've worked with. And if it's not the right thing for them, let's do something else. You don't help people by bringing them down the road where maybe you can make money on them, but that's not really worth it. So I think part of it too is professionals kind of congregate, and so the attorneys and the trustees and the valuation firms, they like to talk about a lot of the complexities, which is fun. And I think that's engaging. But when I always tell this as a new professional that comes into our firm, your job is not to know everything about tax. Your job is to be able to take, say, for instance, tax and explain it to your customer so well that they understand it. Because that's how you become, I think, a very good service-oriented professional, and that applies itself to ESOPs.
I think some of this, honestly, is just cultural shift. I have just seen a massive change into what employees expect when they come to work, what owners are trying to do in terms of make something meaningful, actually create a place where they both enjoy showing up for work and they enjoy being around the people that they work with. And that idea has been expressed, I'd say, in the last 5 or 10 years as this idea of purpose. And the more data is coming out showing that businesses that start from a place of purpose, ironically, often outperform financially those that don't have a sense of purpose. And so I think an ESOP is a much more natural extension of that idea of living a life of purpose.
I do think I see a change in people's anticipation of what their career looks like, right? What they want to do with their life. So you do see a new generation coming into the workforce that has some different ideas, some of which play better in an ESOP because everybody's sharing into not just the ownership, but the responsibility of the future, as opposed to maybe the older generations were more keen to, I want to make a lot of money. And I'm not, again, there's nothing wrong with making money, but their main focus was the ambition of building wealth. I think that people they're broadening their idea of what a successful life looks like. And I think the ESOP plays well into that cultural shift.
How about the idea that these things seem to be marketed more along the lines of this is great for the employees and paying less attention to what it means for the entrepreneur? Do you think that's an issue?
I will say it needs to be a holistic plan as you kind of build it all. So eventually we need to understand how the employees will be affected. But at the very front end, my idea behind the process itself and proving out does the ESOP even work is you got to nail down what the individual owner is looking to accomplish. And that's outside of all the other parameters of employees. I've got one right now, and we're going to do the meeting next week. And it's a single owner of a company, really nice company. And he asked me, should I have these people on the phone? And I said, let's just, you and I talk. Let's just go through the first valuation model. I want to hear from you without bias. I don't want you to tell me what your people want to hear. I want to know what you want. And my goal there is to be able to have a very, concrete conversation about, can we accomplish what he wants out of this transaction? Because then as time goes on, if we accomplish that, then we can start adding on all these elements. And eventually it becomes, how does this affect the employees?
Let me ask you a very specific question that came up in our previous conversations. We have a regular on the podcast named Jay Goltz. He hit upon something that confused me, and I'd like to see how you respond to it. He started to think about it in these terms. He was thinking about selling 30% to his employees. And because he doesn't really need the money, it wasn't about getting the money off the table for him. He would do it by a loan and let the employees pay him back directly. But then he started to think about it, and it occurred to him that they would basically be paying him, in his opinion, with his own money, because they would be using profits earned by the company that would have been his if he hadn't sold. So he came to the conclusion that if he did this transaction, he wouldn't be selling the company to his employees. He'd be just giving it to them. Was he right about that?
Okay, so if I generalized everything first and I said, okay, the cash flow that is going to be used to pay Jay out is generated by the company is a true statement. Now, if the owner is looking to transition the ownership into whether it's a sale to my employees as an employee stock ownership plan, or it's a sale to my key persons, or I'm going to sell it to a strategic buyer. Ultimately, the owner's trying to get their money out of the business. Like, what is it? What's the valuation, and how are they going to get their money out of the business? A typical structure of an ESOP transaction, I would say most of the ones I do will have some bank financing and some seller financing, which means the owner at closing is going to get a liquidity event as much as the bank can lend on that ESOP transaction. So they are getting something that's out of the company. Like, say in that structure, immediately that the company now has borrowed and is now in debt to pay back. In addition to that, they're also going to get the seller note. But he's right about the cash flow. It has to be the cash flow that pays him back. Now, I think the idea is like, if I just hold on to this, then I'll keep the cash flow no matter what. And I think that's where Jay went with it. And that's true. And the question for every owner is going to be, at what point are you willing, from a risk reward standpoint, to hold on to that cash flow? And then when you are ready, now this is why some ESOP transactions are partials, because they're not ready to release the ownership transaction or the ownership stock right now, but maybe they are a little bit because they want to have some chips off the table and they feel like the valuation is enough to benefit them to make that really work. But that he's, so generally speaking, he's right, but it's really in how you structure it. If there's a lot of bank financing, for instance, then he or she's going to get their money at the closing. And now they've been paid, say, some percentage of the total valuation.
There's another issue that I've heard come up from time to time, which is what happens when employees leave the business, whether it's for retirement or if they just choose to change jobs and go somewhere else. It can, I gather, put a company in a bind of having to come up with a chunk of money to pay out. How big an issue is that?
There's not a concern. Like what I'm trying to do with a client is work through the anxiety points. There's really not going to be, because we're building models that really will work. We'll go back and forth on those several times to make sure that it works for everybody, the company, the individual shareholder. So by the end of our plan, we know where we're going to be. We know we can weather a downturn. So I think that's really important too. If your advisor's doing that work, they need to get into the numbers really well, and they need to everybody needs to understand what is going to be paid out. So we'll burden the company, for instance, with all the compliance costs of an ESOP. So you have to have an annual evaluation. You have to have a third-party administrator. You have to have fiduciary insurance. You have to have possibly a trustee involved. So those costs are going to need to be in the cash flow models. Anything else that we're anticipating that's going to come up. I have a client, we're doing a deal right now, and we know we're going to buy, we're going to invest in 2 new stores. That's built in the cash flow model. So I think that's the key part of getting to the next step. If we get through cash flow valuation, then getting through the feasibility model.
Sean, has this affected your thinking at all? Is it as attractive as before? More attractive? Less attractive?
No, I mean, what I appreciate about Phil's way of working is it's methodical and one step at a time, and there isn't a foregone conclusion that you become an ESOP. And what I contrast that to, let's say you hire a business broker to sell your business, they want you to sell your business because they get paid on that percentage of that deal. And I think anytime somebody comes along and says, let's see if this is the right fit for you. And I assume, Phil, you get paid by the step as opposed to by the completion. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things, like I don't charge a success fee. So it doesn't even matter what we end up selling it for. We're going to do the best job. And I've had where we get into a point where we're not going to go forward. And I think what I've helped them with is like, at least you didn't go into the whole big old nightmare of spending a bunch of money on this and, realizing it's not for you. So I think and that is predominantly in the ESOP industry, how it's done, by the way, is firms charging a success fee.
Explain that. What's the success fee?
Well, so an investment banking firm doing an ESOP transaction, like they would do a sale for a strategic buyer, they're going to, just like in a normal, what we call an M&A transaction, they're going to have it look like that, right? We're going to go through the due diligence process. They're going to make an offer. The trustee is going to counter offer. So they're going to go through all that. Feels like an M&A deal, but it's really a regulated M&A deal. If they sell the company for more money, their fee is based on the sale price. And they're going to include in that, if they do source bank financing, they're going to get a fee off getting the bank financing. And there's a dollar amount connected to the amounts that they're securing for people. And so on its surface, it looks kind of normal because people are so used to, an M&A model where I'm going to go get these guys to help me sell my business. But when you think about an ESOP transaction, the problem I have with that is that it's a regulated transaction. It is the Department of Labor is going to have jurisdiction over the transaction, over the valuation, and at any point can go investigate that deal Now, if you look at case studies where companies have been sued as ESOPs, the number one thing they're being sued over is being overvalued. Now, who is going to pay the price in that situation? Not the investment banking firm. There is no jurisdiction the Department of Labor has over them. They've done their work, they're objective advisors, whatever, but it's the selling shareholder and the trustee that are going to have to deal with that, and essentially the company, because if they're found guilty of that, they're going to have to pony up some money to right size it, and it's going to be disruptive. It's going to cost the company legal money. So I think there's problems with the whole model, and going back to some of the original things. That's one of the reasons I got into this, because I do think that the way these transactions are being done is philosophically, misaligned with the purpose and the mission of being an ESOP. I also disagree from the ethical standpoint. I don't think, there's nothing wrong with making money, but they're bolting this whole M&A thing in here, and they're making a lot.
Well, isn't that the argument that they make, Phil? They say, listen, you have options. You could sell it to a strategic buyer, or you could go ESOP. If you sold it to a strategic buyer, we would get a success fee. So we should get the success fee even if you do the ESOP.
Yeah, that's definitely what they'll come in and say, well, at least we can help you provide both paths. And that sounds really nice. But when you really look at the conceptual side of things, I'm going to say, like, hands down, either somebody is really an ESOP candidate or they're really not. So that whole running down two paths, to me, is a very good way to manipulate the situation to get them to realize, oh, well, I'll just spend the money on an ESOP transaction. But all you've done is taken their hard-earned retirement money. Sean owns his own company. I own my own company. What does it take to build a company? It's hard, right? So I would not want somebody to take advantage of me like that, because it's wrong. So anyway, that's why we've built a model that's purely advisory. It's budgeted, and we get our costs out on the front end. Like, this is what it's going to cost. Now, it's never perfect, but it's going to be pretty close at the end of the day before anybody gets involved in any, engagements or getting things started.
So do you think we have the right number of ESOPs in this country, or do you think that there are people who are looking at this and walking away kind of for the wrong reasons?
When I first started getting into ESOPs, doing podcasts and things, I realized, like, the statistics are really low. Like, there's only 7,000 ESOP companies in the entire country. Right off the bat, you're like, there should be more ESOP companies. So I do think, and it's hard to prove out exactly why people don't veer towards this. I think there's probably multiple reasons. I think right off the rip, I'd say there's not enough good education, and I'd say unbiased education. If you go to a conference and you think that the cost of the ESOP is 10 times what it really costs, you're probably going to walk away from that thinking, I'm not going to do an ESOP. I'm too small and it's not going to work for me. So I think that's contributing to it. I'd say the second thing is what I had noted before. The people that they listen to the most are going to be their advisors at home. And if the advisors at home are, intimidated, or they don't really understand it, they're not going to advise it. So I don't think that there's a strong, in the United States, I still don't think the CPAs have trained well on this. Then I think the idea too is that there are companies that do become ESOPs and they do sell. And the reason that happens is become so successful at what they're doing, they become such a great target to be acquired by a bigger company. And it's kind of contrary to the whole idea of mission of, hey, let's build this legacy. But it does happen enough. So if you talk to trustees about their book of business, probably every one of them is going to have some number of their ESOP clients selling that year. It's a truth. You do have this input of new companies and you have this output of ESOP companies selling. So I think, just to answer the question simply, though, I do believe that we should have a lot more ESOP companies throughout the entire country.
That outcome you just described, a company becomes an ESOP, it performs really well, it grows a lot of wealth for the employees, and then it sells. And it sort of seems like, is there any way you can mitigate that, in terms of the structure of the organization, or is it just like it's just a risk, it's part of the deal?
I think it's a good question. And I've thought about that a lot too, and thinking and discussing this with other trustees. The one thing that has to be, because it's a retirement plan, there's a fiduciary responsibility that is going to hang over somebody. And that's typically the trustee. Like they're going to have the responsibility to manage the trust.
In other words, if they get a great offer, they might have to take it.
That's it. That's kind of where I was going with it.
Yeah.
If they get a great offer and the trustee's a fiduciary, then they have to think about the benefit of the employees and imagine, having some nice retirement plan at $20 a share that you're waiting. And then a company comes in and makes an offer at $50 a share. You're like, okay, it'd be hard for the fiduciary not to take that. I think that's the main issue for these types of things. So it partly proves out the concept of what I was saying. ESOP companies outperform non-ESOP companies because they do become good targets. But there's nothing that I know about that can restrict that type of thing happening. It's going to be a fiduciary decision. First off, it's going to be a board of director decision. Like the board of directors is going to be, say, solicited by a buyer. The board is going to have to review that, and they have fiduciary responsibility. If it goes deeper and deeper into it and it's a real deal, then they're going to get their trustee involved and they're going to have to make a decision. So I would say that if the board of directors is not interested from a good business perspective in selling, then I don't think that those deals are going to kind of penetrate unless you just have a very aggressive buyer that wants to get in there and push it really hard.
I'm not sure what you mean by that. Are you suggesting that there is a way to turn away a deal that maybe financially looks good, but there are other issues with?
Yeah. I mean, if the board of directors looks at it and says, this is not the best timing for the company, for again, being a board of director, I think you wear the hat of being a good business person for the company. So you have these governance rules or guidelines that say the board is really there to do what's best for the company. That's their job. And the trustee is there to do what's best for the ESOP, then direct the plan according to its governance, right? So they kind of work in tandem. The business decision itself rests with the board to entertain the offer. If the offer gets entertained, then the trustee's going to have to review it. It has to go through the board first. So I'm not suggesting that the board, if they had a really legitimate offer, could just circumvent the trustee completely. But I'm saying that if they have like a business plan that says we're not really ready to go out in the market yet, we're doing these other things, it needs to make sense from a business perspective for them to not maybe take an offer.
So it does leave the possibility that you have a business owner who creates and builds a business and decides to go the ESOP route, and with the goal of creating a special place to work, a great company where people enjoy being employed, that does good things and makes money, pays people well, and they sell it 100%. And then one day in the not too distant future, the people who are at the company decide, you know what, we'd like to take the money, and that special place to work goes away.
That's right. I think that's always a possibility.
My thanks to Sean Bussey and Phil Hayes, and of course to our sponsor, The Great Game of Business, which helps businesses use an open book management system to build healthier companies. You can learn more at greatgame.com. Thank you both. Wait, don't leave yet. If you have a question or a comment that you'd like the 21 Hats owners to address, send it to me by replying to your morning report or by email at lauren@21hats.com. That's LOREN @21hats.com. Do it now before you forget. And don't be afraid to tell Jay what you really think. He can take it. And if you got something out of this conversation, help us reach more business owners. Tell a friend. Subscribe and review us wherever you get your podcasts. Follow us on Twitter. Subscribe to the Morning Report at 21hats.com. This episode was produced by Jess Thuberon, founder of Blank Word Productions. Okay, now you can leave. Thanks for listening, everyone.